helpless young woman is brutally attacked by her own husband and mother-in-law, but when the truth about her past and the shocking evidence finally emerges in court, the entire room falls silent and their cruel plan collapses in a way no one expected. The house looked peaceful from the outside. Every morning, sunlight gently spilled across the small front yard, warming the quiet street and touching the pale curtains that hung in the windows. From a distance, it looked like the home of a happy family. Neighbors often saw a young woman moving quietly inside, sweeping the floor, watering the small plants near the doorway, or hanging freshly washed clothes on a thin line stretched across the yard. Her name was Laila. She had married into this family only a year ago, leaving behind the familiar comfort of her childhood home. Like many young brides, she had carried hopeful dreams with her, dreams of building a peaceful life, sharing laughter, and slowly creating a place where love lived in every corner. In the early days, everything had seemed normal. Her husband was polite, sometimes quiet, but never openly cruel. And his mother, well, she spoke little at first. Her sharp eyes watched everything, but her words were few. Laila had told herself that it was simply the way older people were. Strict, perhaps, but not unkind. So she tried her best. Each morning she woke before sunrise. She prepared breakfast carefully, making sure the tea was warm and the bread was fresh. She cleaned every room until the floors shone and the air smelled faintly of soap and jasmine. She wanted them to be proud of her. Sometimes, when she placed the food on the table, she glanced at her mother-in-law, hoping for even the smallest sign of approval. A smile, a nod, a gentle word. But it never came. Instead, there were long silences, and looks, cold looks that lingered just a little too long. "You should clean the kitchen again," the older woman would say suddenly, even when it was already spotless. Or sometimes she would sigh loudly while examining the food. "This is too salty. This is not how our family cooks." Laila would lower her eyes and quietly apologize. Her husband rarely spoke during those moments. He simply continued eating, avoiding her gaze as if the tension at the table did not exist. At night, when the house finally grew quiet and the lights dimmed, Laila sometimes lay awake staring at the ceiling. Maybe if I try harder tomorrow, things will be better. But something in the house felt different lately. The air was heavier. The silence between conversations lasted longer. Even the footsteps in the hallway seemed sharper, more impatient. One evening, as Laila was washing dishes, she heard voices from the living room. Her mother-in-law was speaking in a low, irritated tone. Her husband answered quietly, but there was frustration in his voice. Laila couldn't hear the full conversation. Only fragments. "She doesn't belong here. I told you before. This cannot continue." Her hands froze in the sink. For a moment, the sound of dripping water was the only thing filling the kitchen. What were they saying about her? She slowly returned to washing the dishes, pretending she hadn't heard anything. But a strange feeling crept into her chest, an uneasy weight that she could not explain. Sometimes danger doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary days, slowly growing in the silence. And Laila had no idea that the quiet house around her was already beginning to change. Because behind those walls, something dark was slowly preparing to reveal itself. At first, the cruelty came quietly, not with shouting or violence, but with words. Sharp, cold words that cut deeper each day. The morning sunlight entered the kitchen as usual, but the warmth it brought no longer reached Laila's heart. She stood near the stove, carefully stirring a pot of tea while her mother-in-law sat at the table, watching her with narrowed eyes. "You are too slow," the older woman said suddenly. Laila quickly placed the cup in front of her.
"I'm sorry."
"I will try to be faster." The woman took a sip and immediately placed the cup down with a loud clink. "This tea is terrible," she snapped. "Ever since you entered this house, nothing has gone right." Laila froze. Her hands tightened around the edge of the counter. Her husband sat nearby, scrolling through his phone. For a moment, Laila glanced toward him, silently hoping he would say something, anything, to defend her. But he didn't. He simply shrugged. My mother knows better, he said calmly. You should listen to her. Those words landed heavily in the room. After that day, the criticism became constant. Every small mistake turned into a lecture. Every effort Laila made was dismissed as useless. If she cleaned the house, the mother-in-law complained about dust in a corner. If she cooked dinner, she was told the food tasted wrong. Even when she stayed silent, she was accused of being disrespectful. You bring bad luck, the older woman muttered one afternoon. Our home was peaceful before you arrived. The words echoed painfully inside Laila's chest. Why does she hate me so much? Days slowly turned into weeks, and the tension inside the house grew heavier. The husband began to change too. At first he had simply ignored the arguments, but now he had started repeating his mother's words. Sometimes his voice became louder, sharper, filled with impatience. One evening, Laila accidentally dropped a glass while washing dishes. The sound of it shattering against the floor echoed through the house. Her husband rushed into the kitchen immediately. What did you do now? He snapped. I'm sorry. It slipped, Laila whispered. His face darkened. You are always making problems, he said angrily. For the first time, he stepped closer in a way that made her uneasy. Too close. His presence suddenly felt threatening. He didn't touch her, but the way he stood there, blocking her path, staring down at her with frustration, made the air feel tight and suffocating. Behind him, his mother watched from the doorway with a cold smile. See, she said quietly. She is careless. This girl will destroy our family. Laila slowly bent down to pick up the broken glass pieces, her hands trembling slightly. The kitchen floor reflected the sharp fragments like tiny mirrors. But something else had broken that evening too. The small hope she once carried into this house. And as she cleaned the shattered glass, one quiet question echoed inside her heart. When did this home stop feeling safe? Outside, the night grew darker. Inside the house, the tension continued to grow, slowly turning cruel words into something far more dangerous. The night felt unusually heavy. Outside, the street was quiet. Most of the houses had already turned off their lights, and the cool wind moved gently through the dark neighborhood. Inside Laila's home, however, the silence felt tense, like the air was waiting for something to happen. Laila stood in the kitchen, finishing the last of the dishes after dinner. The soft sound of running water filled the room, but her hands moved slowly. She could feel it again, that strange pressure that had been growing inside the house for days. In the living room, her mother-in-law sat stiffly on the couch, whispering something to Laila's husband. Their voices were low, but the tone was sharp. Laila tried not to listen, focusing instead on the plates in front of her. Yet suddenly the whispering stopped. Footsteps approached the kitchen. Her husband entered first. His expression was different tonight. His face was tense, his jaw tight, and his eyes filled with an anger she had never seen so clearly before. Behind him, his mother followed quietly, her eyes cold and calculating. Why are you always causing trouble in this house? The older woman demanded. Laila turned slowly, confused. I didn't do anything, she said softly. Her husband slammed his hand against the table. Don't lie, he shouted. The sound echoed sharply through the kitchen. Laila flinched. I'm not lying, she whispered, her voice shaking. Please, tell me what I did wrong. But neither of them answered her question. Instead, her mother-in-law walked toward the stove. She placed a metal pot onto the burner and turned the flame on high. The sudden hiss of gas lighting filled the room. Laila frowned slightly. Why are you heating water? She asked nervously. The older woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly filled the pot with water and stood there watching it, waiting. Behind Laila, her husband suddenly stepped closer. Too close. Before she could react, his hands grabbed her arms. Hard. What are you doing? Laila gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. Stop moving, he said coldly. Panic rushed through her chest. She struggled, trying to break free, but he was stronger. In one rough motion, he forced her down against the kitchen floor, pressing her shoulders firmly so she couldn't move. "Let me go!" she cried. Her voice trembled with fear. From the stove, the faint bubbling sound of water beginning to heat slowly filled the room. Her mother-in-law turned around. Her face was calm. Too calm. She walked slowly toward them, glancing at Laila lying helpless on the floor. For a moment, the room felt frozen in time. Laila's heart pounded wildly inside her chest. This can't be happening. Her eyes darted toward the pot on the stove, where small bubbles were beginning to rise to the surface. The water was starting to boil, and suddenly, a terrifying thought flashed through her mind. Were they really going to hurt her? The older woman lifted the pot carefully from the stove. Steam rose into the air. Her husband pressed Laila down harder as she struggled beneath him. The kitchen lights reflected off the rising steam, casting long shadows across the walls. In that moment, Laila realized something horrifying. The cruelty she had endured for months had finally reached its darkest point. And tonight, there might be no one to stop it. The kitchen felt unbearably silent. Only the low bubbling sound from the pot and Laila's frightened breathing filled the room. Steam rose slowly into the air as her mother-in-law held the metal pot tightly in both hands. The heat from the boiling water shimmered under the bright kitchen light. Laila struggled beneath her husband's grip, her heart racing wildly. "Please stop," she begged, her voice shaking with fear. "You're hurting me." But her husband's hands only pressed down harder on her shoulders, forcing her flat against the cold floor. "Be quiet," he said harshly. His voice was colder than she had ever heard before. Her mother-in-law stepped closer, staring down at her with an expression that held no mercy, no hesitation, only resentment. "For months you have poisoned this house," the older woman said quietly. Laila shook her head desperately. "No. I tried to make you happy. I tried every day," she cried. But the older woman did not listen. She lifted the pot slightly higher. The steam brushed against Laila's face, and a wave of heat made her flinch. Her chest tightened with terror. They wouldn't really do this, would they? For a brief moment, the entire house seemed to pause. Then it happened. The pot tilted, and the boiling water spilled. The moment the burning liquid touched her skin, a horrifying scream tore through the house. "Aya!" The pain was immediate and unbearable, like fire spreading across her body. Laila twisted and struggled wildly, but her husband still held her down, even as she cried out in agony. The water splashed across the floor, the sound mixing with her desperate screams. "Stop! Please stop!" she cried. But the attack continued for several terrifying seconds before the pot finally emptied. The metal container clattered loudly onto the floor. Laila collapsed weakly, trembling from the shock and pain. Her breathing was broken, uneven, and her hands shook as she tried to move. Her husband suddenly stepped back, releasing her. For a moment, the kitchen was filled only with the sound of her crying. Outside the house, a neighbor walking past the street stopped suddenly. The scream had been loud, too loud to ignore. He turned his head toward the house, frowning with concern. Inside, Laila tried to crawl away, her body shaking uncontrollably. But her mother-in-law simply watched her from across the room, her face still cold and unmoved. "You deserved this," she muttered quietly. Across the street, another neighbor opened their window. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered. The tension outside the house slowly began to grow as people noticed the disturbance. Inside the kitchen, Laila's weak cries echoed through the dark house. And somewhere nearby, someone quietly reached for a phone. What had just happened inside that home was too terrible to remain hidden. Help was finally on its way. The night that had begun in silence was now filled with distant sirens. Inside the house, Laila lay weakly on the kitchen floor. Her breathing was uneven, and every small movement sent waves of pain through her body. The bright kitchen light above her felt harsh against her eyes, and the room spun slightly as she tried to stay conscious. Her husband stood near the doorway, pacing nervously. His mother remained calm, though her eyes moved quickly around the kitchen, as if searching for something. "We have to say it was an accident," she whispered firmly. Her son nodded quickly. Yes, yes, that's what we'll say. From outside, the sound of sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, painting the walls with flickering colors. For the first time that night, fear appeared on the husband's face. What if she tells them the truth? He asked quietly. His mother's voice turned cold. She won't. She's too weak to speak. Laila heard those words faintly through the haze of pain. Her fingers trembled slightly against the cold floor. I have to survive. I have to tell someone. A loud knock suddenly echoed through the front door. Police! Open the door! The command cut through the house like thunder. The husband quickly rushed to the door, forcing his face into a worried expression. When he opened it, 2 police officers and paramedics stood outside. What happened here? One officer asked immediately. My wife. It was an accident, the husband said quickly, pointing toward the kitchen. She spilled boiling water on herself while cooking. The paramedics rushed inside without hesitation. When they reached Laila, their faces immediately tightened with concern. This is serious, one of them said quietly while kneeling beside her. We need to move her now. They carefully placed her onto a stretcher, speaking gently to keep her calm. You're safe now, a paramedic told her softly. Tears rolled silently down Laila's cheeks. Was she really safe? As they carried her toward the ambulance, neighbors had already begun gathering outside the house. Some stood quietly on the sidewalk, whispering to each other. The earlier scream had drawn attention from more people than the attackers had expected. One police officer turned toward the husband and his mother. You said this was an accident? He asked slowly. Yes, the older woman replied quickly. She dropped the pot. But before the officer could respond, a quiet voice spoke from behind the small crowd. That's not true. Everyone turned. A middle-aged neighbor stepped forward hesitantly. His face was serious. I heard everything, he said. The screaming, the shouting. And I looked through the window. The street suddenly fell silent. The husband's face turned pale. The officer stepped closer to the neighbor. What exactly did you see? The man took a slow breath. I saw him holding her down, he said, pointing toward the husband. And his mother. She was the one with the pot. The quiet street filled with shocked murmurs. In the distance, the ambulance doors closed as Laila was rushed toward the hospital. And in that moment, the carefully planned lie began to crumble. Because sometimes the truth finds its way out, even when people try desperately to hide it. The hospital room was quiet. Soft beeping from the medical machines echoed gently in the air, while pale morning light filtered through the window. Laila lay in the hospital bed, wrapped in white bandages, her body weak from the pain she had endured. The events of that night still felt like a nightmare. Every time she closed her eyes, the memories returned. The steam rising from the pot, the cold grip of her husband's hands, and the unbearable heat that followed. A nurse carefully adjusted the blanket around her. You're safe here, she said softly. Laila nodded faintly, though her eyes were filled with exhaustion. Safety felt like a fragile word now. For days she barely spoke. The doctors treated her injuries, while nurses came and went quietly. Sometimes the room felt peaceful, but inside her mind, the fear had not disappeared. What if they come back? The thought haunted her. One afternoon, a police officer and a woman from the legal support team gently entered her room. Their expressions were calm but serious. We know this is difficult, the officer said carefully, but we need to understand what happened that night. Laila's hands trembled slightly as she held the edge of the blanket. For a moment she hesitated. Her voice felt trapped inside her chest. Then she remembered the neighbor's words, the way someone had spoken the truth when she could not. Slowly, she took a breath, and she began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, but each word carried the painful truth of what had happened inside that house. The officer listened closely, writing down every detail. Outside the hospital room, the investigation slowly began to grow stronger. The neighbor who had witnessed the attack gave a full statement. Another neighbor confirmed hearing the screams that night. Medical reports carefully documented Laila's injuries, proving the burns could not have been an accident. Even small details started raising questions. The police discovered that the husband and his mother had given different versions of the story. Their explanations did not match. The lies were beginning to fall apart. Days turned into weeks as the case slowly moved forward. During that time, Laila began physical therapy. Every step was painful, every movement a reminder of what she had survived. But with each passing day, her strength slowly returned. Sometimes she stood by the hospital window, watching people walking freely outside. A quiet thought often crossed her mind. Would justice really come? But deep inside her heart, something had changed. The fear that once silenced her was slowly turning into determination. I will not stay silent anymore. Eventually, the investigators gathered enough evidence to move the case forward. Witness testimonies, medical records, photographs of the injuries, and the clear contradictions in the attacker's story. The truth was no longer hidden. The case was officially prepared for court. Soon, the people who believed they would never be held responsible would have to face the consequences of their cruelty. And Laila, though still healing, was ready to face them. Because sometimes the road to justice is slow and painful, but every step forward carries the power of truth. The courtroom felt colder than the hospital room ever had. Rows of wooden benches were filled with quiet spectators, journalists, and a few curious neighbors who had followed the case since that terrible night. The soft murmur of whispers filled the air, but it quickly faded as the judge entered the room. Court is now in session. The sound of the gavel echoed sharply. Laila sat quietly beside her lawyer. Her hands rested gently in her lap, though her fingers trembled slightly. The scars hidden beneath her sleeves reminded her of everything she had survived. Across the room, her husband and his mother sat side by side. They looked calm, too calm. When the judge asked them how they pleaded, the husband stood confidently. "Not guilty," he said firmly. His mother nodded in agreement. "It was an accident," she added. She spilled the boiling water herself. For a brief moment, a quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Laila lowered her eyes. The lie sounded so simple, so effortless. How can they pretend nothing happened? The trial began slowly. The prosecution called the first witness, the neighbor who had heard the screams that night. He stepped forward nervously, adjusting his jacket as he took the stand. The lawyer asked gently, "Can you tell the court what you saw?" The neighbor took a deep breath. "I heard shouting from their house," he explained. "Then I heard the woman screaming. It didn't sound like an accident." The room grew quieter. "And what did you do next?" the lawyer asked. "I looked through the window," the neighbor replied. Every person in the courtroom leaned slightly forward. "I saw the husband holding her down," he continued. "And his mother. She had the pot." A wave of whispers moved through the audience. The husband's expression tightened, but he remained silent. More witnesses followed. Another neighbor described hearing the desperate cries for help. The paramedics explained the severity of Laila's injuries and how the burns clearly showed the water had been poured intentionally. Then the medical expert took the stand. "These injuries are not consistent with a simple spill," the doctor said carefully. "The pattern suggests the liquid was poured from above." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the scratching of pens stopped. The defense lawyer tried to challenge the statements, but each answer only made the truth clearer. Piece by piece, the story the attackers had created began to fall apart. The judge watched carefully, his expression growing more serious with every testimony. Laila finally lifted her eyes and looked across the room. For months, fear had controlled her life. But now something different filled her chest. Strength. Because the truth was no longer hidden. And the question that lingered quietly in everyone's mind was impossible to ignore. If it was really an accident, why did every piece of evidence say otherwise? The courtroom remained silent as the final witness stepped down. And for the first time since the trial began, the confidence on the husband's face began to fade. The truth was finally standing in the light. The courtroom had grown heavy with tension. Hours of testimony had already passed. Witnesses had spoken. Experts had explained the injuries. Yet the defense continued repeating the same claim again and again. It was an accident. The husband sat with his arms crossed, trying to appear confident. Beside him, his mother remained stiff and silent, her face calm but her eyes restless. For a moment it almost felt like the trial was reaching its end. The judge glanced at the papers in front of him. "Does the prosecution have any additional evidence?" he asked. The prosecutor slowly stood. "Yes, Your Honor," he said calmly. "We do." A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Even Laila lifted her head slightly. The prosecutor walked toward the center of the room holding a small device. "This evidence was recently discovered during the investigation," he explained. "It is an audio recording captured on a neighbor's phone the night of the incident." The husband's expression instantly stiffened. His mother shifted in her seat. "What recording?" the defense lawyer asked quickly. The prosecutor placed the device on the table. "The neighbor who called the police had been recording a message on his phone while standing outside," he said. During that recording, voices from inside the house were captured. The room suddenly felt frozen. The judge nodded once. "Play the recording." The prosecutor pressed a button. For a second, only faint background noise filled the speakers. Then voices appeared. Clear voices. The first voice was the mother-in-law. Cold. Angry. "You have to hold her still," she said sharply. A quiet gasp moved through the courtroom. Then the husband's voice followed. "I am holding her. Just do it quickly." The recording continued. "You think she can ruin our family?" the mother-in-law snapped. "After tonight, she will learn her place." The sound of struggling could be heard faintly in the background. And then Layla's desperate voice appeared in the recording. "Please, don't do this." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. The husband's face turned pale. His mother's hands began to shake. The recording ended. For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence was overwhelming. Laila felt tears slowly forming in her eyes as she stared at the table in front of her. "They can't lie anymore." The defense lawyer stood quickly. This recording could be misunderstood, but the judge raised his hand. "Sit down." His voice was firm. Across the room, the jurors exchanged stunned glances. The evidence was undeniable. The confident story the attackers had repeated for weeks had collapsed in less than a minute. One small recording had revealed everything. The courtroom slowly fell silent again, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Now everyone could see the truth clearly, and the people who believed their cruelty would remain hidden were finally facing the consequences of their own voices. Because sometimes the most powerful evidence is not a document or a photograph. Sometimes it is simply the truth captured in a single moment. The courtroom was completely silent. No one whispered now. "No papers shuffled." Even the faint ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. Everyone was waiting. At the front of the room, the judge looked down at the documents in his hands. His expression was calm but firm, the kind of expression that carried the weight of a final decision. Laila sat quietly beside her lawyer. Her heart was beating fast, yet her face remained still. The long months of pain, recovery, and fear had led to this single moment. Across the room, her husband and his mother looked very different from when the trial had begun. The confidence that once filled their faces was gone. Now there was only tension and fear. The judge slowly raised his eyes. "In this court," he began, his voice steady, "we have heard the testimonies of witnesses, the analysis of medical experts, and the evidence presented during this trial." The room remained perfectly still. The evidence has clearly shown that the injuries suffered by the victim were not the result of an accident. The words landed heavily in the courtroom. Laila felt her fingers tighten slightly. "The audio recording presented confirms that the actions of the defendants were deliberate," the judge continued. "This act was cruel, violent, and completely unjustifiable." A quiet breath moved through the room. The judge paused for a moment before speaking again. "For these reasons, the court finds both defendants guilty." The gavel struck the desk with a sharp sound. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Laila closed her eyes briefly as the words echoed inside her mind. Justice. Her husband lowered his head, his face pale. His mother sat frozen beside him, unable to hide the shock that now filled her eyes. The judge continued speaking, announcing the legal consequences of their actions. But Laila barely heard the details. Her mind had already drifted somewhere else. To the hospital room where she had once wondered if she would survive. To the long nights when fear tried to silence her voice. And to the moment she decided to tell the truth. "I made it through." A single tear rolled slowly down her cheek, but this time it was not from pain. It was relief. Weeks later, Laila stood outside a small rehabilitation center, feeling the warm sunlight on her face. Her body still carried scars from that terrible night. Some wounds would take longer to heal than others, but her spirit was no longer broken. She had found something stronger than fear, courage. And as she slowly stepped forward into a new chapter of her life, one quiet question remained in the hearts of those who had followed her story. How many people suffer in silence, waiting for the strength to speak? Laila's story became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the truth can rise and bring justice with it, because courage has the power to change everything. Moral: when a victim finds the courage to speak, justice finally finds its voice.